I want to talk about, I'm in pre-service teacher education too, so some of what I do relates to what other people have been talking about this morning. And I've also worked in outdoor education for quite a long time as well, so I'm combining both of those areas. And what I'm talking about is a project that I've been studying as part of my PhD research. So I'll give you a moment to read this statement to start off with. So what we have here is a pre-service teacher talking about his experience of teaching Year 9 students in a sustainability unit in a secondary school. And he's talking about his love of gardening. He also talked about his love of riding bikes and how he enjoyed sharing those experiences with students. And then he thought the most successful teaching that he did was when he was doing that, when he was sharing his passions with the students. And in a more informal setting of the outdoors. He didn't enjoy the classroom teaching. And one of the interesting things to me about this is that as he was talking, when he's discussing eating food out of a bin, that's because he and his fellow housemates, all of whom were involved with this project, they really did try to live lightly. And they did things like, you know, they built a big vegetable garden, they got chooks, they didn't have any heating, which in Bendigo, where this is situated, is quite significant in the winter. And also, they retrieved most of their food that they ate in the house from the local skips outside Coles and various shops. So they did that intentionally. Obviously, there was economic benefits for them, but also they wanted to use food that had been discarded and was still largely in its use-by date. So they did that as a regular practice. I even went to their house one night for dinner and the whole meal was out of the bin. So, but their issue was how to broach this with students. They wanted to share that with students, but it's not strictly legal. So that created a bit of an ethical dilemma for them. In the classroom they didn't raise it, but it just happened they were eating some of their bin food at lunch when they were in the outdoors, and they were talking about it, and some kids overheard them and started asking them. And from then on, the students were really engaged in the issues because it allowed them to talk about the issues around waste and access to food and so on. So it was in some ways that more informal outdoor environment that actually allowed engagement with some of those issues, or that the pre-service teachers felt able to do that. So it in itself initiated a different kind of learning than they would have had in the classroom. There's also something of a garden theme to this presentation, partly because it reflects praxis. It reflects some of the actual practical work that the pre-service teachers chose to do, and it also reflects some of the theory. So this Peter Becker is a German outdoor educator, and he talks about gardening as actual pedagogy, the benefits of using gardens, largely based on his concerns that young people are spending too much time on screens and aren't interacting or having any visceral, sensory or sense of time relationship with nature because of that. So he was advocating gardening as one of the things that we can do readily, that don't require great expense and it's very accessible. And he talks about the benefit of paying attention and requiring patience and engendering a sense of nurturing and care. However, he also talked about the benefits of experiencing what he calls wild nature, which is a different kind of experience in terms of spontaneity, surprise and curiosity perhaps. Another issue that he raised was that on a more figurative level, on one hand, in the garden, people have to make decisions, and they're trying to obviously nurture plants, and they're making decisions about what's a weed and what isn't. So they value judgments about what's good and bad, and in that it raises issues around morality, which he's talking about in a figurative sense as well as the literal sense. So just to look at a few of the views of the pre-service teachers about their task to teach sustainability with these Year 9s. To put it in perspective, the Year 9s the school had never had this unit before. It was brand new. The teachers had never taught it. The teachers were humanities and science teachers, and the pre-service teachers were outdoor education teachers. So it was meant to be a cross-disciplinary project. The school had just merged with another school, and it was a virtual building site because the whole school was being rebuilt. So it was a massive kind of time of change in which they introduced this new project. So our student teachers were coming into this context, and this is what one of the students said. He said he talked about it as a scary task, that the future was scary, but he was also excited because he wanted to try to make a change. I thought an interesting point was he didn't think the normal school system would allow for that. So he sees schools as essentially conservative and perhaps not conducive to making any significant sort of change. The other comment that was interesting made by another student was they were talking about their starting point with the Year 9 students, and they recognised from observing the teachers in the classroom over a period of weeks that the students weren't really turned on to the concept of learning about sustainability. In fact, they were already sick of it before the pre-service teachers started. So they were saying, they need to try to make it a cool thing to do. So they kind of recognised that they needed to somehow engage those Year 9s and create an attitude shift in the first place. So I'm saying that's, in a way, it's like pulling the weeds. It's like creating the fertile ground for learning and growth. They recognised that before they even started. So very briefly, this project was in Bendigo, 150 kilometres north of Melbourne. Most of you, has anybody doesn't know about Bendigo? Okay, so it's a gold rush town, surrounded by a forest, which is now a national park, but highly impacted by the gold activities of the past and present. And it's a growing town of over 100,000 people, which has no natural water source. So in terms of its actual sustainability, it's an interesting situation. The people in my study were 12 pre-service teachers who were in either a Bachelor of Physical Outdoor Education 4th year or in a graduate diploma, and they all had outdoor education teaching method in common. They'd only had one practicum prior to this, so this was their second time that they'd been in schools teaching. And they were working with teacher mentors, as I said, who were humanities or science in terms of their discipline. They were also, the remit from the school's perspective was to do team teaching. None of the teachers had done that before, and neither had the student teachers. So there was a lot of newness in this. So in that sense, it was supposed to be cross-disciplinary, and the significant thing with the sustainability imperative and the cross-disciplinary nature of it was that there were no experts. Even the teachers didn't see themselves as experts. So that had interesting repercussions in terms of their roles and their relationships. There was no template for participation either. They were more or less making it up as they went along. So my research project, I looked at 3 teams. There were 4 pre-service teachers in each team and 2 mentors. And the mentors, I interviewed the mentors as well, but my main focus was on the pre-service teachers' experience of this program and how it impacted their professional development. So over 18 months, I conducted mainly interviews and focus groups, also surveys and field observations. The theoretical framework, I'm still working on a better way to represent this, but it's meant to show complexity and integrated systems. So I've drawn on the work of many people, including Stephen Sterling, who when he looked at systems, he made sure that the natural systems were represented as integrated with social systems. And I've taken that up as well in my study. But mainly I'm using cultural historical activity theory and communities of practice to look at the relationships and the work of the pre-service teachers. I just want to mention that in terms of the context, at this stage of this study, Bendigo had just had a 10-year drought. We'd had level 4 water restrictions for quite a long time. We'd just experienced the Black Saturday fires, where 60 houses were razed and one person lost their life in Bendigo. So, you know, there were some actual real physical realities that also shaped the way that students thought about what they should teach and perhaps how they should teach and where they should go. At the same time, we had a national action plan called Living Sustainably. I'm sure you're all aware of that, for sustainability education. So there was some government impetus. There was also, in the Victorian VELS curriculum, there was recognition of sustainability as an emerging priority, and climate change policy was high on the government agenda at the time. In terms of the institutions, there was a Bendigo education plan which for all the state schools in Bendigo. So all of them were getting new open plan buildings. So their classrooms, normal classrooms were going, and they had large open plan spaces, which had obvious implications for teaching and learning. And the university was trying to develop new practicum models at the same time, partly to deal with the Bendigo education plan, and also to cater for differences in the student cohort or different needs. So I'll go back one. So just very briefly, initially the pre-service teachers' conceptualisations of sustainability, I think, were quite constrained by their outdoor education experience. I say constrained because they tended to talk about sustainability as mainly to do with the environment, and they tended to see that as being about ecology, natural history, and those sorts of things that they had personally experienced. Some of the students were more aware of thinking about daily living and impacts of daily living practices, and a few of them were quite interested and involved in thinking about climate change and what that might mean and the complex issues around that. But I saw that some of the key gaps that I saw was that there wasn't really any awareness at that stage of political, economic or social justice perspectives of sustainability. And that's something that over time changed somewhat, but not uniformly for all of those pre-service teachers. And they had some work on sustainability in the university prior to that, specifically sustainability, but that also was fairly piecemeal. There wasn't a coherent program at the time. I'll just let you read that firstly. The reason why the school asked for the outdoor education method was because they wanted to engage the Year 9 students in a more practical, applied way. So they thought that this would be the way to go. So the pre-service teachers were well aware of that, but also it was their own experience and inclination to create a practical hands-on, they used the term hands-on a lot when they were talking about what they did, way to learn. So they wanted to link what they did in a classroom to what they did in the outdoors. They were required to run a 2-day camp, an overnight camp, with a sustainability theme. So they did that in various ways, but they always were very conscious of trying to whatever was learned in the classroom was enacted as much as possible on the camp. So they did things like spent time with the Year 9 students talking and learning about sustainable foods and thinking about what might that mean. And then they had the students organise their food for the camp, trying to make it as sustainable as possible. And I remember one group, the pre-service teachers were very keen to have a vegetarian menu, but the Year 9s were aghast at that idea. That was just too much, that was beyond the pale. So then the pre-service teachers said to the Year 9s, well, if we must have meat, what would be sustainable meats? And eventually the group came to the idea that they could have kangaroo, so they had kangaroo bolognese for their main meal, and they had locally sourced vegetables and homemade bread that they made and so on. So they tried to build into the structure of the camps some rethinking of perhaps normal practice or what the students would be used to. Also, the way that they got to their camps was by foot or local bus or on bikes. So they tried to build those concepts in, rather than just be doing what the students would think, you know, like going to some camp in a bus and then just running some ordinary activities. They really thought about what they were doing. In this instance, they went to a primary school that was a sustainable school and had been for many years, and they raised pigs and cows, amongst other things, and the children in the primary school raise them, and then they know that they will be slaughtered and that their meat will be sold to their parents and for themselves to eat. The primary school students well understood that, but the Year 9 students, when they heard about it, they were in shock. So a lot of those students hadn't ever thought really that meat came from an actual animal that they could see in front of them and that they could pat. And they are from a regional area, so it was amazing. So those pre-service teachers followed that lesson up with a video on looking at what goes on in abattoirs, and then there was a really quite powerful discussion after that. So, but their argument was that if they hadn't been to that property, and if they hadn't been near and with the pigs and learning about them, that they could have shown that video and it wouldn't have had the same kind of impact. 2 minutes, okay. So I'll go quickly through this. One of the things I'm interested in is what went on amongst the pre-service teachers in their teams and between the pre-service teachers and the mentors, and how those roles played out and impacted their experience. I'm looking at Anne Edwards' work on relational agency, and in recent years she's also developed that concept further to include what she calls common knowledge, which is shared. It's not just shared knowledge, but if you have practitioners working together who have different backgrounds or expertise, it's knowledge that is understood to the point that people can actually work productively together, and that's knowledge that has to be developed. Relational expertise is understanding what matters to others and being able to understand their standpoint, where they're coming from, which I think for sustainability in general is an important way to think about it. Relational agency is it's about collaborative work. It's about recognising the motives and interpretations of others, and then being able to align your own motives and interpretations with those to work effectively and productively. So, given I've only got 1 minute, I'll just skip on a little bit further. So in their team teaching, the pre-service teachers and the mentors really showed that they had been able to work relationally very successfully in their teams of peers. They had been able to negotiate, they'd been able to listen to each other's ideas and to come to agreement where they had differences. In terms of their conceptualisation, they were constantly having to change and adapt, so they were taking ideas from others, bouncing their ideas off their peers and changing their planning of their lessons and their camps all the time. And they were very open to that. The other interesting thing was that in the actual teaching space, some of them really talked about that idea of tuning into the other person, and it's almost tacit knowledge that we're seeing there, that they could, after a while, get what was going on with that person and with the class, and they were able to kind of mould their own behaviour to the other person. And I have to stop now, so I will do that, but I'll just leave you with one. There's a lot of other things I could talk about, but I'll just leave you with this image and these words of the pre-service teacher. Thank you.